The air at a countryside estate in Ohio smelled like wildflowers and champagne, and for a moment, it truly felt like the happiest day of my life. Sunlight poured through wooden windows, the band played softly, and every seat was filled. Logan stood at the altar, calm but searching for me. Everything looked perfect, except for 3 empty chairs in the front row. We waited and waited. Then gravel crunched outside. Camille stepped in smiling, and what she said next would change everything. I grew up on a quiet suburban street in Ohio, the kind where lawns were trimmed with precision and evenings smelled faintly of cut grass and laundry detergent drifting from open windows. From the outside, our house looked like a postcard version of family life. My father, Richard, worked long hours as an electrical engineer. My mother, Nancy, managed a small family-owned restaurant downtown. We had routines, we had structure, we had smiles when guests came over. On paper, we were perfect, but perfection has a way of hiding its cracks in plain sight. From my earliest memories, Camille was the center of everything. She had a voice that filled rooms without trying. When relatives visited, my mother would usher her forward like she was presenting something precious. Our little star, she'd say, her eyes shining in a way I rarely saw directed at me. Camille told stories, performed impressions, recited achievements, and everyone listened. When I tried to add anything, the conversation moved on as if I hadn't spoken at all. At first, I didn't think much of it. I told myself this was just how families worked. Some people were louder, some people were brighter. Maybe I was just meant to be the quiet one. By the time I reached my teenage years, that belief had settled into me like a permanent truth. My father would come home, tired, his briefcase still half open while the television hummed in the background. If Camille and I argued, he rarely intervened. If she raised her voice, he sighed. If I cried, he'd pat my shoulder and murmur, "Don't make things worse." Then he would disappear behind his newspaper. Silence became the rhythm of our home. It wasn't explosive. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. And somehow, that made it heavier. My mother had a way of praising Camille that somehow diminished me in the same breath. When I brought home an A on a science test, she smiled and said, "Camille did it first." When I made the soccer team, she reminded me that Camille had been captain at my age. Every milestone felt like I was tracing footsteps already carved into the ground. Nothing I did was just mine. After a while, I stopped competing, not because I couldn't keep up, but because I was exhausted from trying to prove that I deserved to exist in the same room. I learned that achievement didn't bring recognition, it brought comparison. And comparison always ended the same way. Chores became my quiet territory. I washed dishes while Camille rehearsed for school plays. I folded laundry while she prepared for debate competitions. My mother would say it was good for me, that being helpful built character, that humility was a virtue. I told myself maybe she was right. Maybe being useful was another form of love. It took me years to realize it was just another way to stay out of the spotlight. There were moments, small, fragile ones, when I tried to bridge the distance. Once I asked Camille to help me with a school project. She laughed lightly, almost surprised I'd even asked. "I don't have time for something that simple," she said. My mother overheard and stepped in, but not in the way I hoped. "Don't take it personally," she told me. "Your sister is busy with bigger things. I went back to my room. That night, and lay on my bed staring at the ceiling. I remember wondering why it felt wrong to want attention from my own family. Why asking for help felt like asking for too much. My father's silence framed every conflict, and when he did speak, his words carried no weight. "You girls will figure it out," he'd say before retreating again. The unspoken rule in our house was that peace mattered more than fairness, and peace meant pretending. Pretending the comparisons didn't sting. Pretending the favoritism wasn't obvious. Pretending that shrinking yourself was maturity. I became very good at that. I apologized quickly, even when I wasn't wrong. I stepped back before anyone could ask me to. I learned to read the room to sense when Camille needed space to shine, and I gave it without being asked. My mother's approval always hovered just beyond reach, like something I could almost grasp if I tried harder. Stayed quieter, did more. Camille's shadow stretched across everything. Looking back now, I can see how much of myself I folded away, just to keep the surface calm. I thought love meant patience. I thought being unseen meant being good. If I wasn't causing tension, then I was contributing to harmony. That was the story I told myself. But harmony built on silence isn't harmony at all. It's absence. Every forced smile, every swallowed word, every time I chose quiet over honesty shaped me. I became adaptable, enduring, easy, the one who didn't complain, the one who could be counted on not to disrupt the balance. Balance, that was the word my parents would have used. But the balance only worked because I carried the weight. As the years passed, I stopped expecting fairness. I stopped hoping for intervention. I learned that if I wanted the house to stay calm, I had to stay small. And the strange part is, I believed that made me the good daughter. I believed that shrinking was strength. Silence followed me into adulthood. It wrapped itself around my decisions, my relationships, the way I navigated conflict. It felt familiar, safe even. Because in my childhood home, silence was survival. What I didn't understand back then was the cost. You don't notice how much space you've given up until one day you try to stand tall and realize you don't quite remember how. 3 months before the wedding, Camille called me for the first time in years. Her name lighting up my phone felt strange, almost unreal. For a second, I just stared at it, my thumb hovering above the screen. When I finally answered, her voice came through bright and polished, too smooth, too warm for someone who had kept her distance for so long. "Tess, I was just thinking about you," she said, like no time had passed at all. She told me she wanted to help plan the wedding. I hesitated. Not long enough for her to notice, but long enough for something inside me to shift. I couldn't tell if this was her way of making peace, or simply finding a stage again. Before I could respond, she added that she had already spoken to Mom. They both thought it would be fun to collaborate. Fun. The word sat awkwardly between us. I told her it sounded nice. My voice was calm, measured, the way it had always been when I was trying to avoid friction. But even as I said it, something in me whispered, "Be careful." That same night, my mother called. Her voice carried a liveliness I hadn't heard in years. "Isn't it wonderful?" she said. "Camille is so excited to be involved. You should appreciate this, Tessa. Family moments like these don't come twice." I stood in the kitchen, tracing small circles on the counter while Logan poured tea beside me. I smiled into the phone and said I understood, that I was grateful, that of course I wanted everyone included. When I hung up, Logan raised his eyebrows slightly. I didn't have to explain. He already knew what help usually meant in my family. A few days later, Camille sent a long email. It was structured, almost professional, full of links. Downtown Columbus venues with high ceilings and crystal chandeliers. Floral designers known for extravagant arrangements. Catering companies with curated tasting menus. Even a stylist she claimed could elevate the overall aesthetic. Her tone was persuasive without being obvious about it. A city venue would better reflect your new life, she wrote. I read that sentence more than once. Better reflect your new life. As if the quiet countryside estate Logan and I had chosen near the river, surrounded by oak trees and golden fields, was somehow outdated, small, insufficient. But that place felt like me. Calm, open, uncomplicated. I wrote back politely, thanking her for the suggestions, explaining that Logan and I had already chosen a countryside estate because we wanted something intimate and personal. I kept my words gentle, careful not to sound defensive. The next morning, my phone buzzed. It was my mother. "You really should listen to your sister," she said, her tone edged with disappointment. "She knows what looks elegant." Elegant? The word stung more than I expected. I told her I was happy with our plans, that Logan and I wanted something simple. There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a sigh. "You're being stubborn," she said quietly before ending the call. The ache in my chest was painfully familiar. It felt just like it had when I was younger, whenever I dared to choose something different from Camille. As if independence was defiance, as if preference was rebellion. That evening, Logan and I sat on the porch, watching the light fade over the garden. I must have been quieter than usual because he reached for my hand without saying anything at first. "You don't owe anyone control over your wedding, Tess," he said softly. "It's supposed to be your day." There was no anger in his voice, just steadiness. For a moment I felt grounded, like I could breathe again. I promised myself I wouldn't let this become another battle. I wouldn't allow old patterns to creep in. This time would be different. But battles in my family never arrived loudly. They began with small remarks, polite smiles, suggestions wrapped in concern. Over the next few weeks, Camille called more often. She mentioned she had connections who could get discounts on decorations, a friend who could design invitations better than the ones I'd ordered, someone who could upgrade the lighting setup to make it more dramatic. Each suggestion came packaged as a favor, and yet underneath it there was always the same message. What you've chosen isn't quite enough. At first I brushed it off. I told myself she was just excited, that maybe this really was her attempt at being supportive. Then vendors started calling to confirm updates I hadn't made. The florist mentioned changes to my bouquet design. Apparently, someone had suggested fuller arrangements with imported flowers instead of the wildflower mix I'd chosen. The venue manager emailed about a revised lighting plan that had already been approved. Approved by who? When I traced each change back, the answer was always the same. Camille? She had begun contacting people directly, introducing herself as assisting with the bride's coordination. She spoke confidently enough that no one questioned it. When I confronted her gently over the phone, she laughed. "I'm just making sure everything looks right," she said. "You'll thank me later." I didn't feel grateful. I felt watched, managed. Logan grew frustrated. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened when I explained another unexpected call from a vendor. He offered to step in, to call her himself, to draw a line, but I stopped him. I didn't want to turn our wedding into a war zone. I didn't want raised voices, fractured relationships, ultimatums. So I sent Camille a short message instead. Thank you for your enthusiasm, but please let me handle things from now on. Her reply came almost instantly. I was only trying to make sure you don't embarrass yourself. I stared at the screen for a long time. Embarrass yourself. The words felt less like concern and more like a verdict. Suddenly, I wasn't 32 planning my wedding. I was 14, again, standing in a kitchen where my choices were quietly corrected. I was the younger sister who didn't quite measure up, the one who needed guidance, the one who should be grateful for improvement. The old wound opened so easily. That night, I deleted the email chain. I told Logan we would keep everything small, private, simple, just as we'd planned from the beginning. He didn't press me for details. He just nodded and wrapped his arm around my shoulders. I didn't tell him how uneasy I felt, how certain I was that this wasn't about centerpieces or lighting or venues. It was about control, about narrative, about who got to stand at the center of the room. Camille had always known how to do that. And deep down, beneath the polite messages and careful boundaries, I felt something darker gathering. The way you sense a storm before you see the clouds, the air shifting, the quiet growing heavier. I had spent my whole life shrinking to keep peace. This time I had chosen something that was entirely mine, and somewhere inside, I knew she wasn't going to let that happen without a fight. I just didn't know yet how far she was willing to go, but I could feel it. This wasn't over. It was only the beginning. A week before the wedding, the air started to feel off. It began with a photo. Camille posted it late in the evening, a mirror selfie in a long white gown. The fabric draped softly around her elegant and unmistakably bridal. Her hand rested lightly in her hairs, her expression poised, almost dreamy. The caption read, "Can't believe it's almost here." Within hours, the comments flooded in. Heart emojis, congratulations. You look stunning bride people who clearly assumed the wedding was hers. I stared at my phone in disbelief, my thumb hovering over the screen. Maybe it was harmless. Maybe I was reading too much into it. But the dress was white, and the timing wasn't subtle. I sent her a private message, careful with my words, calm. "Camille, could you take the photo down? People think you're me." Her reply came almost instantly. "Relax, it's just a dress." No apology, no acknowledgement. Just that same cool dismissal I'd heard my entire life. Before I could respond, she changed her profile picture to another shot from the same fitting. The ache in my chest felt embarrassingly familiar. When I called my mother hoping, just once, that she might understand, she laughed lightly. "She's just excited," she said. "You know how your sister is." Yes, I did. That was exactly the problem. I wanted to explain that excitement didn't look like imitation. That excitement didn't blur boundaries. But the tone in my mother's voice made it clear that this too would be smoothed over, minimized, filed away under personality. My father called the next evening. His voice was softer than usual, careful. He said he would come early on the wedding day to help with setup. It was a small promise, almost fragile in the way he delivered it, but it meant more to me than I expected. After years of watching him step back, even that small gesture felt like an attempt. "I'll be there before the guests arrive," he said. I thanked him more than once. For a brief moment, I let myself believe things might settle, that maybe the tension I felt was just pre-wedding nerves, that maybe I was imagining storms where there were only clouds. A few days later, Renee stopped by unannounced. She brought coffee and fresh flowers, calling it a sanity check. The moment she stepped into the house, her eyes scanned the room in a way that made me feel seen. "Tess," she said gently, setting the flowers down. "Is everything okay? The energy here feels tense." I laughed too quickly, told her it was just stress, that weddings did this to people. But Renee didn't look convinced. "Just remember," she said softly, before she left, "it's your day, not anyone else's." Her words lingered long after the door closed. That same afternoon, Miles the photographer came by to check the lighting around the garden and reception area. The estate looked beautiful in the late sun, golden light filtering through oak branches, ribbons shifting in the breeze. For a moment, I felt calm again. Then Camille appeared. She walked across the lawn in a pale silk dress that shimmered under the sunlight. Not white this time, but close enough to feel intentional. She moved like she already owned the space, scanning everything with an appraising glance. Miles adjusted his camera, clearly focused on testing angles. Camille stepped beside him, so she asked casually, tilting her head, "Do you think I photograph better in natural light or under chandeliers?" He hesitated. I caught his glance toward me, quick, apologetic. Camille leaned closer to him, then her voice dropping just enough to sound private, but not enough to be missed. "Poor Tessa," she whispered. "She's trying so hard." The words sliced through me. Miles pretended not to hear, returning to his settings. The birds seemed quieter. Even the breeze felt heavier, like it had thickened mid-air. I stood there, forcing myself to breathe evenly, to not react, to not create a scene. That evening, I found myself alone on the porch as the sky faded into a bruised shade of violet. The estate, which had once felt like sanctuary, now felt uncertain, like something fragile that could be disrupted at any moment. Logan stepped outside and asked if I was okay. I nodded, but the truth sat heavy in my throat. I could feel at the edges of something gathering. Not loud, not explosive, just subtle shifts. A smile that lingered too long. A comment that carried more than it said. A promise that felt breakable. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt like waiting. And as the final days ticked down, I realized I wasn't just anticipating vows and music and celebration. I was bracing for what exactly I couldn't name. But deep down, I knew one thing with unsettling clarity. The calm wouldn't last. By the time the wooden doors finally opened, relief should have washed over me. It didn't. The ceremony had already been delayed for 2 hours. Guests shifted in their seats, fanning themselves with folded programs. The band had stopped playing half an hour earlier their instruments, resting awkwardly beside the stage. What had once felt warm and glowing now felt heavy, like the entire room was holding a breath it didn't know how to release. Whispers moved in small waves through the crowd. Curious, pitying, restless. I stood beside Logan Bouquet, clutched tightly in my hands, trying to keep my smile steady. My cheeks felt stiff, my lips dry. He reached for my hand and squeezed gently. That small, steady pressure was the only thing keeping me upright. Then I heard it. Car doors closing outside. The sound echoed through the open archway, sharp against the thick silence. Heads turned in unison. My chest tightened so suddenly it almost hurt. Camille entered first. Her hair was styled like she was stepping onto a runway. She walked ahead of my parents, followed by a small group of her friends, laughing as if they had just arrived at a dinner party light. Loud, unbothered. The delay, the waiting, the tension, none of it seemed to exist for them. My mother offered a wide smile to the guests, a gesture that looked apologetic from a distance, but didn't reach her eyes. My father avoided my gaze completely. Camille slowed near the aisle, glancing around at the decor. "Cute place," she murmured loud enough for several rows to hear. On its own, the comment might have passed as harmless, but the smirk that followed twisted it into something sharper. A few guests exchanged glances. I felt heat rise to my face. Logan's hand tightened around mine. We began. The officiant's voice trembled slightly as she welcomed everyone. The words floated into the room, but didn't quite settle. The air felt almost visible, dense and strained. My father stood to read the blessing he had promised. He unfolded a small piece of paper from his pocket. His hands were shaking. Just as he began to speak, a loud clatter split the silence. One of Camille's friends had dropped her phone. The sound of it hitting the wooden floor bounced through the room like a slap. She bent down, whispering an apology through a giggle. Camille laughed too, brushing it off as if it were adorable. The moment fractured. My father's voice faltered. He glanced toward my mother, then toward me, and continued. But the strength had drained from his words. What was meant to be sacred now felt thin, like it could tear at any second. When he finished, my mother stood abruptly, smoothing her hands over her dress, as if physically pressing down the tension. "It's such a beautiful day," she said softly. But she wasn't looking at me. She was looking at Camille. Camille tilted her head and smiled back that same knowing expression she had worn all week. The one that always made me feel small. The officiant invited us to say our vows. I turned toward Logan. For a moment, just one, the room disappeared. His eyes were steady grounding, calm in a way I desperately needed. I started to speak. My voice quivered at first, but I pushed through, focusing on him, on us, on the future we had chosen together. It might have been peaceful, if not for the whispering. Near the back, Camille leaned toward one of her friends. I couldn't hear the words, only the soft murmur followed by stifled laughter. My stomach twisted. The officiant's gaze flickered nervously in their direction, but she said nothing. I finished my vows with my pulse pounding in my ears. Logan spoke next. His voice was low, sure, unwavering. I could feel the anger simmering beneath his calm, but he kept it contained for me, for us. When the rings were brought forward, I let myself believe we were almost through it, that we could still salvage this, that the ceremony could rise above the interruptions. Then Camille stood. The scrape of her chair against the floor was loud enough to command the room. Conversations died instantly. Even the soft rustling of fabric seemed to stop. She smiled widely, her eyes glittering under the chandelier light, and she said something. I won't repeat it. I couldn't even if I wanted to. The words didn't fully register at first. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room the moment she spoke. Like everything slowed and warped around the sound of her voice. Someone dropped a champagne glass. The sharp crack of it breaking on the floor echoed through the silence. No one moved. Logan turned toward me, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle shift. His expression was blank in that dangerous way, controlled, but barely. His hand tightened around mine again, not gently this time. My face felt numb. I could feel the blood draining from it, my heartbeat roaring in my ears. The guests were frozen eyes, darting between us, waiting for something, anything to happen, but nothing did. The silence that followed was complete, heavy, unbearable. And in that suspended moment, standing there in front of everyone, I understood with chilling clarity. This was no accident. This had been building all along. And whatever Camille had just set into motion, there was no undoing it now. The email from Miles arrived 3 days after the wedding. Tessa almost deleted it. The subject line was simple raw footage, private. No emojis, no congratulations, just that, clinical, heavy. She sat at the small kitchen table in the countryside house she and Logan had returned to after everything collapsed into silence. Outside late afternoon, light filtered through the trees, soft and forgiving. Inside her hands felt cold. Logan looked up from the sink. From Miles. She nodded. She clicked. The first few clips were ordinary camera tests. Guests arriving, the band tuning, the empty aisle before anyone walked it. Her bouquet resting on a wooden chair. Innocent, quiet fragments of a day that had once felt sacred. Then the timestamp shifted. The angle changed. A side camera, candid, unfiltered. Camille stood near the entrance of the venue, not knowing she was being recorded. She wasn't smiling. She was studying the room, the countryside barn. Tessa's barn glowed with warm string lights she had spent months choosing. Soft linen runners, wildflowers gathered from local farms, everything understated, everything hers. Camille tilted her head. "This is it," she said, laughing softly. "This is what she thinks is elegant." Someone off camera asked something Tessa couldn't hear. Camille adjusted the white gown she had chosen for herself, white of course, and smirked. "Oh, it'll be unforgettable," she said. The way she said it made Tessa's stomach turn. Not hopeful, not affectionate, strategic. The footage cut to another clip. Camille near the lighting setup speaking to one of the assistants. "Can you make it brighter up front? It's so dim. I don't want the pictures looking cheap." The word landed like a bruise. Tessa kept watching. Another clip. Camille in a corner with their mother Nancy. "You really let her do this rustic thing," Camille whispered, though not quietly enough. Nancy's expression was unreadable. She didn't smile. She didn't correct her. "She's sensitive," Nancy said carefully. "Just let her have her moment." Camille's eyes flashed. "Oh, I will." There was no warmth in it. The footage shifted again, Camille checking her phone, typing quickly. A grin spreading across her face. Tessa leaned forward. "I told you," Camille said to someone beside her. "If she insists on playing small, someone has to give the guests something worth remembering." Playing small. The phrase struck deeper than the rest, because that was what Tessa had done her whole life. Shrunk herself, kept things modest, made herself easier to love, and here it was mocked. Another clip showed Camille walking through the aisle before the ceremony, testing how the dress moved when she stepped, twirling slightly, practicing, as if she were the one about to be married. The final piece of footage was the most difficult. Camille stood alone near the back entrance, the noise of guests building inside. "This is going to be perfect," she murmured, not to anyone else. To herself. Her smile wasn't joyful. It was anticipatory, like someone waiting for a spark to reach dry grass. The video ended. Silence filled the kitchen. Logan had come to stand behind her at some point. His hand rested lightly on her shoulder. He hadn't spoken. He didn't need to. Tessa replayed one section, the word again. Unforgettable. Not in the way she had hoped, in the way Camille had intended. She closed the laptop slowly. For a long moment, she just stared at her reflection in the darkened screen. There it was. Proof. Not misinterpretation, not sensitivity, not insecurity. Deliberate. She opened her email again. She attached the file. Recipient mom. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She typed only one line. "I think you should see this." She pressed send before she could soften it. The reply came faster than she expected. Barely 20 minutes. Her mother's name flashed on the screen. Tessa opened it. "You're overreacting." That was it. No question, no concern, no acknowledgement of what the footage showed. Just the same sentence that had followed her since childhood. "You're overreacting. You're too sensitive. You're making it bigger than it is." The air in the kitchen felt strangely still. Tessa didn't cry. That surprised her. There was a time, years of time, when she would have drafted a careful response, explained how it made her feel, highlighted timestamps, tried to make her mother see what she refused to see. She would have defended her hurt as if it were a thesis that required evidence. Not this time. She read the message once more. "You're overreacting." It wasn't even about the wedding anymore. It was about every time she had swallowed disappointment to keep peace. Every time Camille's behavior had been reframed as confidence. Every time Tessa's pain had been reduced to exaggeration. Logan watched her quietly. "Are you going to respond?" he asked. She considered it. She imagined typing paragraphs. Imagined arguing. Imagined asking her mother why she hadn't said anything in that video. Why she had stood there while Camille mocked the venue, the lights, the dream. But the answer was already in her inbox. "You're overreacting." Tessa closed the email. "No," she said. The word felt unfamiliar, not angry, not dramatic, just final. She stood and walked to the window. Outside, the wind moved gently through the tall grass. The house was quiet in a way that felt different from the silence she'd grown up with. This silence wasn't oppressive. It wasn't demanding that she make herself smaller. It was spacious. She realized something, then not in a burst of rage, but in a slow, steady release. She was done trying to convince them. Done trying to prove her experiences were real. Done hoping that evidence would transform denial into accountability. For years, hope had kept her tethered. Hope that if she was calm enough, kind enough, reasonable enough, they would finally choose her. The footage had ended that. Not with fireworks, not with confrontation, with clarity. She picked up her phone and muted the family group chat. No announcement, no explanation, just a small quiet action. Logan stepped beside her, his presence solid and warm. "You okay?" he asked gently. Tessa nodded. For the first time since the ceremony, the nod wasn't forced. "I am," she said, and she meant something different by it now. Not that she was unhurt, not that it hadn't mattered, but that she no longer needed their acknowledgement to validate what she had seen with her own eyes. The shift was subtle, hope loosening its grip, release settling in its place. The countryside light outside continued to fade soft and gold. Inside the house felt steady. For once, the silence did not demand that she shrink. It allowed her to stand. The drive back to suburban Ohio felt shorter than it should have. Tessa kept both hands steady on the wheel, watching the familiar exits pass like markers in a life she had already outgrown. The grocery store with the fading blue awning, the elementary school playground where she had once waited for someone to notice she was good at something. The rows of tidy lawns trimmed to compliance, nothing had changed. The houses still stood in quiet symmetry, brick fronts, identical mailboxes, flags hanging in obedient stillness. The air itself seemed preserved, as if time respected this neighborhood too much to disturb it. She parked in front of her parents' house. The curtains were drawn exactly as they always had been. The flower beds Nancy tended every spring were neat and unremarkable. It was the kind of home that suggested stability from a distance, inside the same muted beige walls. The same framed photos Camille's graduation portrait centered and enlarged, Tessa's tucked slightly off to the side. The same polished dining table that had hosted 1,000 careful conversations. Nancy opened the door with a tight smile. "You drove all this way for this?" she asked, already bracing. Richard stood behind her, hands in his pockets. He looked smaller than Tessa remembered. Camille wasn't there. "Of course she wasn't. I just want you to watch," Tessa said. Her voice surprised her. It was calm, not trembling, not sharp. They sat in the living room. Tessa connected her phone to the television. The screen lit up with the still frame of the barn before the ceremony. She pressed play. No one spoke while the footage rolled. Camille's voice filled the room, light, mocking, strategic. "This is it." Nancy shifted in her seat. When Camille said cheap, Richard's jaw tightened. He stared at the floor. Tessa didn't look at the screen anymore. She looked at them. She watched the flicker of recognition in her mother's eyes, the quick calculation, the instinct to minimize, the pause where guilt might have lived. When the clip played of Nancy standing beside Camille, saying nothing, the silence in the living room thickened. Richard cleared his throat but didn't speak. The final clip ended. The television returned to black. For a long moment, no one moved. Nancy exhaled first. She didn't mean... Tessa lifted a hand gently. Not to silence her in anger, just to stop the pattern before it began. "You weren't late," Tessa said, her voice steady. "You were cruel." The words landed without force. No shouting, no shaking. Just truth. Richard looked up, then eyes glassy. "We didn't think." "I know," she replied. That was the problem. Nancy's lips pressed into a thin line. "You're taking this too personally." Tessa almost smiled at the predictability. "No," she said softly. "I'm finally not." That was the difference. She wasn't there to win, or to convince, or to extract an apology they didn't know how to give. She had needed them to see it with their own eyes. That was all. She stood picking up her phone from the coffee table. Richard rose, halfway uncertain. "Tessa." But there was nothing left to add. "I wanted you to understand," she said. "Now you do." Whether they accepted it or not was no longer hers to manage. She walked to the door. The house felt smaller as she moved through it, as though it had always required her to fold herself to fit. Nancy didn't follow. Richard didn't argue. The door closed behind her with a quiet click. Outside, the suburban street looked exactly the same. But as Tessa walked to her car, she realized she wasn't carrying the weight of it anymore. No fight, no scene, just an ending that didn't need to be loud to be real. 1 year later, the air near Lake Erie felt different from the air Tessa had grown up breathing. Cleaner, lighter. She and Logan unlocked the doors to Lighthouse Studio each morning just after sunrise. The space was small but intentional. White walls, Warm wood floors, windows that caught the lake's shifting blues. Couples came in nervous and hopeful, carrying their own fragile beginnings. Tessa moved around them with a steadiness she had earned, adjusting veils, smoothing jackets, noticing the quiet glances between people who chose each other. Photographing love no longer felt ironic. It felt healing. The industry had not been kind to Camille after the behind-the-scenes footage surfaced. Vendors distanced themselves, invitations thinned. The reputation she had curated so carefully fractured under the weight of her own words. Tessa watched it unfold from afar, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. Her parents wrote letters that winter, handwritten, careful, apologetic in a way they had never managed face to face. They admitted to silence, to favoritism, to mistaking avoidance for peace. Tessa read the letters at the kitchen table overlooking the lake. She did not rush to respond. Forgiveness, she had learned, did not require immediate proximity. Distance, she discovered, could be its own form of love, one without harm, without shrinking. On quiet evenings, she and Logan walked along the shoreline, the lighthouse blinking steadily in the distance. Tessa no longer confused chaos with connection. She had chosen peace, and for the first time, peace chose her back. Sometimes walking away isn't an act of anger, it's an act of care. Not every door closes with a slam. Some close softly so your heart can finally rest. If you've ever chosen distance to protect your peace, you're not alone. Healing can be quiet, steady, and deeply personal. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your experience. And if you'd like to stay for more stories like this, you're always